Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you so much for joining us and being here. I'm Kevin Allen, Director of Product Marketing for Valid Mind, and I'm so excited to welcome you to our Valid Thoughts series. This is our webinar series today. We've got an amazing presenter, Juan Martinez, my colleague. I'm so excited. He's going to be presenting on navigating model risk management challenges, strategies for compliance. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Juan Martinez. Take it away, Juan.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for attending this first Valid Thoughts. I'm very excited to be part of it and to be part of the first webinar. So as Kevin mentioned, today's webinar is going to touch on model risk management. We're going to share some challenges, and we're going to go over some of the strategies that actually hopefully people will find useful for increasing efficiency of model risk management processes. So this webinar also, I think, it comes at the right time, because now with all emerging regulations, both in model risk management, but also in artificial intelligence. So I thought it could be a good way to start our series, so people can hopefully use some of these insights or tips for their day-to-day job, and to make their job more efficient, to make their frameworks more successful. So in this webinar, basically, we're going to go through three key areas. Basically, regulation. We're just going to briefly go to latest regulation in model risk management, and then just wanted to share some lessons learned, turning to challenges and strategies that I experienced during my career as a developer and then a validator, but also recently at ValidMind, building model risk management technology. So yeah, hopefully you're gonna find it useful, and please feel free to interrupt anytime, ask any questions. I'll be happy to answer to the best of my abilities. So in terms of regulation, it is very interesting now. The model risk management regulation in the UK just went live basically 10 days ago, 17th of May. So this is a major breakthrough in model risk management in 10 years after SR 11.7 came out in 2011 in the US. And it got published a year ago, supervisory statement, model risk management principles for all banks. That was in May 2023. And I thought it would be useful to share a bit of overview on this particular regulation in the UK. The PRA has taken a sort of a step-by-step approach to model risk management regulation. The predecessor to this regulation actually started in 2018 in the stress testing department at the PRA. So the PRA issued the first model risk management principles in the UK, and it's a principle-based approach. But this regulation only applied to a stress testing model, so to banks actually participating in the concurrent stress test exercise. So recently now in 2023, the PRA expanded those guidelines, those principles, and issue the first regulation for model risk for all banks. In this case, following this step-by-step approach, so at this point, this regulation only applies to banks that uses internal models for capital requirements. So these are major banks in the UK, but the idea is that once the industry learns from this regulation in the UK, this might be expanded to actually all the banks, in a similar way that SR 11.7 that applies to all banks in the US. So during the past year, so the banks from May 2023, they have gone through a self-assessment where they had to identify basically gaps with the current frameworks. Most of the banks being aligned with SR 11.7 as it was the one available and quite comprehensive, and it have standed the pass of time quite well. But during the past year, one has gone through some challenge actually, trying to identify gaps in the current frameworks, and also start to create some remediation plans to be ready for May 2024, this month. In these remediation plans, obviously firms need to issue the findings, and so they can actually start getting ready for that. And 10 days ago, it just went live. So now banks have 1 year to go over to implement these principles. And so I thought it was a good, as I mentioned before, was a good time to now hopefully share some insights about how professionals in model risk can actually implement these successfully. So once these principles are implemented, then the PRA will incorporate model risk assessment to their quality reviews for banks. So I think is quite important step. Also, I think it's going to provide a lot of guidance even for banks that do not use internal models for capital requirements. As I mentioned before, this is going to be expanded, or that's the idea, to all banks. So and it's a good framework to follow and to be able to be ready for what's coming. Also, I want to say that this regulation as well is very useful for AI. Obviously, the financial industry has a bit more experience with regulation of models, and other industries, healthcare, automotive, can actually also benefit a lot from model risk management principles. So I really encourage to professionals that they need to start developing guidelines and policies for AI to actually take a look at the PRA principle for model risk. So just going to give a bit of an overview of what the SS 123 principles look like. So as opposite to SR 11.7, model risk management principles in the UK at the PRA is more principle-based approach. SR 11.7 is more guidance. Obviously, there's a lot of information there, and as I mentioned before, it's been really useful for banks when there was no regulation, even in the UK. Myself, in my previous job when I was a validator, actually I tried to align as well some of the policies with SR 11.7, so it was quite useful. The way the PRA has articulated the framework is, I find it quite useful and really good. This principle base, the framework is structured into 5 core principles, and inside each one of them, there are sub-principles that they go deeper into each one of the aspects that each principle touches. So here in the slide, you can see in between brackets some of the areas that belong to each one of the core principles, and these are sub-principles that actually position really well banks to be able to transform this regulatory framework into concrete guidelines that will fit their policies. So that is quite useful. One thing to mention as well in terms of this particular regulation is that obviously after 10 years, it has benefited from all the lessons learned in the financial industry. So this this framework includes some aspects that they were not covered or not covered in detail in SR 11.7, like more details about, especially around post-model adjustments or third-party vendors, which at the moment is something that is quite useful to see in banks. Banks more and more they try to use models, and not all the banks have the ability or the resources to be able to implement these models internally. So we tend to make use of models that are developed by third parties. And obviously these expose the banks to risk, and the PRA mentions that even the SR 11.7, and to some degree, that these models they need to follow, or they need to be scrutinized at sort of the same level as the models follow internally. This is challenging, obviously, because access to information is not the same as you will have in internal models. So it's quite useful, this framework, because it gives a lot of guidelines or details around how to manage the risk of third-party models. So definitely good framework to follow. So in terms of the next part of the webinar, once these principles touch the ground, obviously practitioners, especially head of model risk management, senior management, validators, developers, everybody obviously involved in model risk, they're going to face quite a lot of challenges. Model risk management obviously is new, and it's not something that everybody has been exposed. Banks have been following other regulations that include some aspects of model risk management for different type of models, like credit risk or market risk models, especially that follow capital required regulation. But it's a fairly new, especially obviously in the UK. So I thought I wanted to share briefly some of the challenges that I face myself as a validator, and obviously after that we'll share some of the strategies so, to overcome these challenges. So some of the challenges that I found myself on day to day, so are in the organization, because it expands across multiple risk disciplines, multiple business areas, and obviously this, as I mentioned before, some areas are not exposed to model risk management principles or advanced modeling principles. So that actually is one of the challenges that I think is specific to model risk. Another typical challenge on model, obviously, is that a bit of the some communication challenges as well, or issues between developers and validators. Both they sit in different business units. They have different priorities, obviously competing priorities. This is obviously by design to keep independent between the first line and the second line. But definitely this is something that I think sometimes it gets in the way of efficiency for implementing successful model risk management practices. As I mentioned before, development and validation follow different processes. Model developers, they will have also their own backlogs as well. They will have to they have different priorities. They need to make improvements to the code. They need to deal with deployments. And validators will have different backlogs, which is the findings basically that they issue during the validation exercise. So these differences in the way they interact with models also create some challenges around prioritization and what needs to be implemented first. In some cases, model developers will find urgent to deal with some aspects of the model that maybe haven't been captured by the validator in findings, or they are outside of the validation process because they come from perhaps requests from the model owner or from model users. And obviously, at the end of the day, resources are limited in banks, and one needs to be very careful about how to prioritize between what needs to be done on the first line and what needs to be done from requirements on the second line, which are the findings. No? So that's another challenge that sometimes gets in the way as well. As I mentioned before, model risk management as well, it spans across different business areas: treasury, credit risk, market risk, operational risk, marketing. So some areas will be more comfortable with some of the practices in model risk, like model development, data quality, event documentation, and so on. But some areas they are not that exposed to these modeling concepts, and they don't sometimes even consider, or it's a surprise for them that suddenly they have a model. No? But the PRA in the principles, first principle, includes the definition of a model, no? And it's a quite, it's also obviously, what is a model is a source of controversy sometimes, but the PRA, I think, takes a quite flexible approach with the idea of trying to incorporate as many quantitative tools of different nature as possible. No? In some cases, you might have models that are simple in essence. Maybe the methodology are simple calculators, and obviously for the model owners or the model developers, because of this lack of exposure to these model risk management practices, they will be surprised sometimes to say, "Oh, I have a model suddenly. Do I need to?" But this is very simple, right? So it's good to obviously expose these colleagues as well to these practices and try to make them understand why these things are useful and why they do benefit the bank and the institution. This basically is linked to the next, which is different development practices across business areas. We mentioned that before. Some areas will do model development in a very simple way, perhaps just Excel, and some areas more advanced in credit risk, especially where the models are heavily regulated. The technology and the practices in these areas will be more advanced, and they will be used to more advanced development practices. No? So another challenge that actually is quite important as well is the access to model and data. No? Validators, they need to obviously review models across different departments. As I mentioned before, all the models in the inventory, they need to be validated. And linked to what I mentioned, not all the models are fit for validation in the sense that they are not portable, or it's difficult to set up a modeling environment for the validators to actually interrogate properly the models. Now, we'll touch later on that as well. And obviously, a typical challenge in model risk is the high number of models that keep coming out in banks and new technologies like Gen AI. But the increasing number of models comes from two main sources. One is more and more models are being used. especially now with AI as well. Banks obviously wants to be competitive and they want to make the most of this new technology. Machine learning as well now is becomes easier to develop models and to use models out of the box. There are more advanced libraries that can be used. So people want to start replacing a bit of the qualitative judgment, but more quantitative approaches. So and the other source is that, as I mentioned before as well, depending on the definition of model, you might have more or less models in the model inventory. But the PRA has a quite broad definition and force a lot of departments to include their calculators or the quantitative tools as models. So if before SS123, there were few models coming from credit risk, market risk, now you start seeing this number being increased due to falling into the definition of model. So that's another challenge for validators that they need to deal with. And finally, innovation. Obviously, innovation in banks is challenging as well. Banks are quite averse to change. Change means risks. And especially in areas where models are critical, they are on the critical path and heavily regulated as well, it's difficult for teams to take the risk and innovate. We'll touch on this later on in the presentation as well. So these are some of the challenges that I thought. Obviously, there are many more, but in the presentation we don't have time to go over all of them. But these are the ones that I thought, they stand out, especially when one starts working with boots on the ground. Start to see these type of issues that they get in the way of efficiency and efficacy and model risk. So after the challenges comes the strategies. Obviously, this is a bit of the point of the webinar. And I wanted to go a bit more in detail to some of the basically lessons learned and best practices that I thought could be helpful for people starting to implement MRM frameworks. Some of these strategies I learned developing models, some of them validating models, and recently now building technology at ValidMine as well and interacting with some customers. I thought I put together some of the best practices and tips that could help practitioners to be more efficient and to speed up the MRM processes. So the first one, this is one of the first tasks that a validator will find and that will land in their desks, which is once the MRM principles or framework are gone live, now obviously they need to start creating a number of internal policies. They need to transform these general principles coming from SS123 or SR117 into concrete policies and standards that are aligned with the specifics of the institution. So one can start with MRM framework like SS123 as a starting point. And as I mentioned before, the SS123 is quite good because their principal approach with principles and sub-principles, it breaks down this framework into more actionable items that are more fit for creating policies and standards. So what you see here is basically one structure. It doesn't have to be like this, or of how to break down or extract policies and standards from the MRM framework. It is something to have in mind when I start creating policies. Obviously, is the ownership. Who owns each part of the framework? and what should be included in those policies and standards. So in general, and looking at the principles from the PRA and SR 11.7, for example, one will obviously have one policy that will cover governance and model inventory, definition of model, risk appetite, basically the MRM policy that will include information about the framework itself, how things need to work at the governance level, and what are the processes that need to be in place to be compliant with all the principles. Then you have in SR 11.7, you have a principle for model development and implementation, and obviously this is optional, but it is typical to have model development standards that naturally are owned by the first line. Then you obviously have as well data quality standards as well that should be aligned with MRM, but also the bank might have existing data management policies and procedures as well. Also, obviously, the model validation guidelines. This is where one would find the validation guidelines, all the requirements for independent model validation, and the attestation questions that the model developer needs to answer, obviously, when developing models. And this is the process that follow both the model developer and the validator to validate models. Also, another type of content that is on dedicated document in some cases is the ongoing monitoring guidelines or a standard as well. And these it could be owned by both developers and validators. In some cases, the developers, they will have more exposure to performance metrics coming from the models, from different type of techniques, methodologies. But obviously, the validator needs to ensure that these performance metrics are fit for purpose and are informative, and they obviously carry the risk evidence that senior managers like CRO can actually rely on to have a proper measure of model risk. One of the challenges that practitioners will find as well when the model risk management regulation lands in their desk is basically the fact that this is not the only framework that models need to follow. Before MRM, models they need to depends on the type of model and where they sit in the institution, whether credit risk, market risk, etc. They need to follow existing regulations as well, and model risk management need to coexist with all these existing regulations. This is not model risk management is not a replacement for existing regulations, and the regulator, the Bank of England or the Fed or ECB, is gonna demand compliance with not only model risk management but existing regulations as well. And these are the little boxes you see under each one of the model risk management specific policies and procedures. What the box here represents are some existing guidelines or procedures in the institution, and these can come from different regulations, as I said, like capital requirements regulations, but also a standard that the institution might already follow, like implementation standards, deployment standards, or even standards, for example, for AI. Now AI is being AI regulation is being developed, and one another challenge, actually talking about challenges, is how to fit AI regulatory frameworks into model risk into institutions. No? And so one of the strategies basically to be able to address these challenges is to try to follow a modular approach. You know? This is good in the sense that it prevents overlapping between guidelines, because some standards in AI risk management or capital requirements or credit risk, some of them, they will have small MRM frameworks inside those, no? And you will see that there are validation requirements in capital requirements regulation, but also the model development team will have their implementation standards. AI risk management will have perhaps data quality standards as well, or performance standards, model performance standards. So with obviously each one of them, they will have their own ownership. They will be owned by different departments, and they will need to be followed as well, like MRM. So one good idea here, one strategy is to break down, try to go to these additional regulations and identify what aspects of MRM can be seen in those regulations. So in CRR, Basel, you will find, as I mentioned before, a little MRM framework embedded there. You will find requirements for data quality, which metrics to use for credit risk, for example, or for market risk, even implementation requirements as well, you know, or guidelines. So is in order to be able to make sure that one can actually be complying with all these regulatory frameworks and standards across the institution, is to break down these principles into blocks that can actually be connected to more abstract standards. So the MRM framework is not very prescriptive, because it's designed to be applicable to all type of models and all type of risks. So the specifics usually come from the different use cases, the different risk types, different methodologies. Obviously, if you develop models in Excel, you might have best practices for developing spreadsheets that might differ from machine learning models developed in Python. Deployment will be different, perhaps, as well. And the performance metrics, machine learning models will have some performance metrics. Gen AI models will have different ones. So it is good to identify what are the abstractions and what are the specifics. And this will allow validators or senior managers in MRM to be able to scale up, and as new regulations come in, they will be able to include those in this framework. So definitely useful to have this map of guidelines. Once we have this map done, the next step is to try to design the guidelines in a way that they can act as actionable risk assessment. So what I mean by that is that traditionally, if you have the validation standards, you will obviously have all the guidelines written there. But after a validation process, the output of these assessments usually stays in these documents, and are a bit they are not exposed to other areas of the bank, to other models. So it is this information is really valuable, but the way in some cases is implemented by having this information in the only perhaps in the validation report limits the amount of rich information that one can actually actually use for more advanced risk assessments across all the models and across all the departments. Also, because these guidelines normally are more, they are found more in validation reports. They tend to cover some aspects of model risk management, but not all aspects of the framework in case. So one interesting tool is to be able to cover all aspects of the framework and to have a modular approach to guidelines is use scorecards. Scorecards are actually a very simple idea. It's basically it's a table where each row is an actionable guideline, and where one can actually score this guideline. And obviously, each one of the attestation items will be linked to model risk areas as well. The good thing about this is that one can actually be quite specific, where one can actually design scorecards that are aligned with different areas of the model risk management framework. And the good thing about using scorecards is that, especially one use color-coded ratings, for example, it gives a very clear it's a very clear approach to identify risk very quickly across different areas. And if one is able to store these guidelines in a database, then suddenly you have a very interesting source of information that can be used actually for many areas, many different types. Like, for example, it is very helpful for identifying concentration risk. If one starts to see reds, for example, in a model documentation scorecard, if one create a scorecard for assessing model documentation, traditionally, if you have only this in the validation report, you don't have visibility across what is happening in other models, perhaps at the time. So having in one view all the guidelines across all the models, across all the areas of model risk, is very interesting. It helps to focus the attention to areas that need particular care, for example, like model documentation or maybe data quality. This can help decision makers as well in the bank to identify gaps, perhaps in resources or knowledge, and then they can start taking an action and plan ahead. And if they see deficiencies in data quality across the bank and across models, then they can start reaching out the data management team and plan a strategy to be able to comply with data quality. Also, the scorecards I found them quite useful to perform early risk assessments. Usually, in some cases, the guidelines are designed when things are in place, when model documentation is written, when the model is developed. But in some cases, the validators don't have the luxury to start the validation process when everything is done. The models need to be validated, and you need to reach out to colleagues. And in some cases, suddenly they see that they need to. Their model is a model under the definition of model, and they need to start documenting the model, putting some controls, and so on, identifying performance metrics. So scorecards are a nice way to be able to do a quick scan, even if not all the evidence is in place. This helps to validators to have an intuition about what's missing, what is required, and quickly go back to developers and request evidence. Another interesting thing about the scorecards as well is that you can track how risk evolves during the model life cycle or during years, during different validations. And you also can detect whether some changes in the bank, some maybe increasing resources, how much impact those changes have had in the actually risk assessment of models. So one start increasing validation resources or model development resources, or putting more attention in documentation. One would expect to see more reds turning to green, and this is possible when using these type of tools, especially when these tools are obviously stored in databases where access to information and analysis is much more efficient and doable than just having guidelines in the validation reports. So what you see here as an example is just I just took the principles of the SS123 and I created some example scorecards that matches with the sub-principles of each one of the principles, just to give an idea of how one would go about that. As I mentioned before, SS123 is very well positioned for transforming general MRM principles into internal policies. So it's very good for extracting actionable principles or guidelines from this framework. So these are a scorecard for model definition, for example, another one for board and responsibilities under the principle of governance. For the third principle, model development and implementation, there is a sub-principle about model design. So you could have one scorecard that aligns with that sub-principle. And for example, in principle 4 for independent model validation, as well, having scorecards that align with this sub-principle. In this case, the independent model validation function. And as I mentioned before, this is a great tool to assure coverage outside the model validation standards as well. Also organize the evidence very nicely, because obviously one regulatory requirement is that information, evidence need to be structured and organized properly. So when regulators knock at your door, you can quickly show what you have done to be compliant. So quite useful in that case. Once the policies and the guidelines have been created, it is a very good idea to expose colleagues in the institution to this new knowledge that has been created. As I mentioned before, model risk management spans across different business units with different exposures to model practices. And it's always a good idea to deliver training to these colleagues. So this, again, is another efficiency gain because for validators, we are a bit biased in some cases because this is our bread and butter. So it's obvious for us that this needs to be done and these policies need to be followed, right? And obviously you can use brute force and just instruct your colleagues to follow policy because they need to, right? But obviously this is never going to work, and it's obviously better to try to understand what challenges other departments have to follow these guidelines and expose them to these principles of why following model risk makes the bank better and why this is one of the key priorities for banks as well. So training usually is a good idea to deliver to all roles within the model risk management framework, and this includes the board. It's actually one of the principles in SS123, the understanding of model risk by the board and by senior managers. So the PRA as well expects banks to designate a senior management function, traditionally the CRO in this case. But this training obviously should be given as well to model owners, developers, even validators within the team, and model users as well. This is an important part as well of delivering training. So model users understand what is expected from them as well in the model risk management process. And below, I just put just an example of what MRM training pack might look like. Obviously, this is very subjective, but this is meant to cover some of the aspects that I think are important and can actually help everybody get on board with this regulation. So one session dedicated to definitely overview of model risk regulation. This is important because they need to understand that model risk is not something that the validator just want to do, but it's something that they have told them to follow. Model risk, especially in SS 123, demands banks to treat model risk as its own risk. So traditionally, model developers in different areas will have no problem to see the challenges or how one should put controls on credit risk or market risk, or what credit risk is or what market risk is. Usually these are quantifiable and more intuitive to understand. And model risk is not as intuitive because it's very difficult to put a number into model risk. So it's important that to make colleagues understand what this is, what the regulation requires, and what is expected from them to help the bank to be compliant with this regulation. Another session dedicated to internal policies and standards, as we saw before, is very important as well. And that links nicely with the first session, for example, on MRM regulation. They need to know what's available and in which way these policies and standards can help them to be compliant. Also, is an opportunity as well for whoever creates these guidelines, usually the validators, to be challenged as well. It is important to expose these guidelines to different colleagues from different departments, because as I mentioned before, model risk spans across different units and different areas, different skill sets, different mindsets as well. So one start writing these policies and standards a bit in vacuum and with a purist approach in some cases. But when these policies touch the desk of some of the colleagues, then this is when the challenges and questions arise. And these sessions are a good opportunity as well for colleagues across the bank to ask questions and to challenge the process as well. It is important to notice that running models through MRM processes is not cheap, it's costly. So they need to justify, as obviously, the work required to onboard and follow MRM processes, to onboard models into model inventory and to take these models through MRM processes as well. Equally important as policies and standards is to expose colleagues to the model documentation and validation templates. What do they need to follow? This is actually the details, and this is what actually they need. What will land in their desk, and they will have a lot of questions about how to document models that actually follows the MRM practices or validation standards, and what the validation templates contain. Because this is what is going to be expected by them as well. These are the questions that they need to be able to answer when developing models. And if the institutions they use some model risk management platforms or special technology, it is important as well to deliver training on those. So we assure that they have visibility on all the resources they need to be able to develop models properly and to make their life easier, as well. So definitely important delivery training. One start documenting models and under model risk management, things change a little bit. Usually model developers, and I talk from experience a little bit, each model developer, they will have their own view on what good model documentation looks like. Some they will put more detail, some less detail. There will be more evidence or less evidence, more plots, less plots, more performance metrics. And obviously the table of contents will differ from model development team to model development team as they see fit. And what this obviously creates challenges as well, because the model validation template is not a mirror of the model documentation. Usually what you see is one validation template, or perhaps 2 or 3, depends on obviously on the size of the institution and the number of models and the type of models. But it's not uncommon to see just one validation template to validate all sort of models. And obviously this is where these different structures creates these challenges where the developer creates evidence through the model documentation that when the validation team needs to review, it is not expected by them. So it's not fit for purpose for the validation process. So it's good to start developing models with validation in mind in this case. And this implies structuring the model documentation in a way that fits the validation process. It doesn't mean all model documentation templates needs to be the same, but obviously something that both the model validation template and the validation reports have in common are the validation guidelines. So both, they need to respond to, or they need to interact with validation guidelines. And one strategy here, one best practice, is to be able to couple different documentation structures with different validation guidelines, with one perhaps validation template, is to use the validation guidelines as a link between the model documentation template and validation report. A way to create this link is to try to segment the model documentation into units or into blocks or into segments. What I mean by this is you can think of model documentation as a collection of text and as a collection of tables and plots. The text is, you can think of being qualitative segments or blocks, and the plots and tables being quantitative blocks as well, or segments. So once you have gone through that exercise, then it becomes easier to start establishing links between these segments in the model documentation and the guidelines in the validation report, or the sections in the validation report through the validation guidelines. So which segments of text, for example, or which plots and tables would act as evidence for which particular guidelines. And this is a way to be able to connect these two documents, and at the same time provide some flexibility for model developers to develop templates in a way that they see it fits better with their type of models or their development workflow. But it is important that all the content in the model documentation is, at the end of the day, linked to validation guidelines, because you can think of the model documentation as obviously answering validation or questions in the validation report. Once you have this structure, then it positions really well to create a path between the detailed evidence produced in the model documentation and how this evidence acts as evidence for wider model risk management principles. Model risk management principles tend to be quite general, as I mentioned before, because they need to be applicable to different type of models. So it's always very useful to create a path between the details at different levels, quantitative evidence and qualitative evidence, to how this makes the compliant with wider principles in model risk management framework. This is makes things easier when sharing this information with the regulators as well. As well, as part of developing models with validation in mind is also the idea of making models accountable as well, and developing models, in this case, accounting for uncertainty and sensitivity. Usually we are used to consume model predictions as point estimates and as the as the truth overall, but obviously for every prediction point, there is more information embedded there than just that single number. And obviously, you want to know, especially validators, when looking at these plots, they need to have a view of how much they can rely on those predictions, right? And in cases you might have models with similar prediction outcomes, but they might. How do you know which one is more reliable than the other? So I find that developing models with uncertainty in mind is quite useful and obviously a best practice to follow regulation. And this is something that is good to have this in mind at the early start, because when the validator comes and demands confidence intervals or sensitivity analysis, sometimes the models are not developed for that. So, and there is no time to make changes in the model to be able to output uncertainty. So, in the case of models, not all the models. For all the models, it's possible to compute confidence intervals in this case, but in those cases, it's good anyway to extract this uncertainty from these models, and there are techniques for that, like I mentioned, sensitivity analysis. And for this as well, you need to be able to develop models that actually can support this type of analysis. By doing that as well, you expand the properties of the model, and suddenly these models as well, they if you develop them with sensitivity in mind, you can have you can stress these models as well, and when stress testing comes, you don't need to develop two models, one for stress testing, one for just normal use. If you have developed the models exposing some key risk drivers in the interface and make them the models being able to support sensitivity analysis. This is always useful, like in the case, for example, of LLMs. It is obviously very challenging to compute confidence intervals. Actually, you can do that. So one way to extract risk from these models and make them accountable, so you can actually have a measure of reliance, is to run sensitivities through those LLMs as well. So definitely that is quite important. Also, once you compute the confidence interval, so you have sensitivities, you can basically you can actually use those confidence intervals as risk management tools as well. You could start using thresholds and start quantifying risk more in a more reliable way, in a more objective way. Suddenly you have threshold of confidence intervals, and as you see in one of the plots on the right, you see for example, a time series. You have the predictions, the confidence intervals, and the historical data. So in some cases, you see model predictions, historical data, but how good is good sometimes, no? The difference between historical data and or actuals and predictions, no? And using confidence intervals, it provides a context, no, that validators can use for challenging sessions with developers as well. No? It can increase objectivity, you know, and therefore it makes the process of validating models a bit more objective and therefore quicker, no? In that. Developing models, thinking about the validation process in mind, is we mentioned that model documentation is obviously full of very rich information, tables and plots, and this is extremely useful, and obviously it should be there. But not all this information, which is good for inspecting the model and criticizing the model, but this information is not fit for sometimes making decisions or reporting or comparison across different methodologies, different models. So a good idea is always to think how one can actually summarize the evidence coming from plots and tables into tangible risk measures. You know? So one way is to be able to transform plots like you see here, for example, a time series with some outliers into a single number that combined with a risk tolerant threshold can convert this evidence into a key risk indicator. When you have that, then you can use these single numbers in your scorecards, as we mentioned before. You can use some of these key risk indicators for feeding model risk metrics that can go into risk appetite dashboards. And it's always useful and speeds up the validation process because it makes the interpretation of this evidence much more clear and oriented to risk when validators need to inspect and criticize these plots, especially sometimes tables. It's difficult to interpret the numbers and whether there is risk or not. So this makes the validation process quite quickly because it's very easy to detect whether something needs attention or not. No? This is just an example of for example, a data validation scorecard. As I mentioned before, once you have the KRIs in place, you can go from an outlier test that produces some evidence, summarize this evidence into a single number, apply a risk tolerant threshold to that number, and suddenly you can report that with color-coded risk scores in a scorecard. And that makes the evidence much more reportable and more fit for validation and for making decisions as well. So another challenge that I mentioned before is the access to information or developer evidence from the validation side. You know? It is one of the most common challenges for validators is the ability for them to access the information in the developer environment. You know? In some cases, validators they will want to probably interrogate the model a bit deeper or criticize the model a bit more, but it is challenging for them during the validation process that is already quite tight in terms of resources and time to set up the validation, the model development environment where they can run models themselves, where they can modify the data or create alternative data sets, edge cases, or even benchmark models to challenge the models developed by the developers. So it is extremely important once first to try to have a common developer framework for as many models as possible across the bank, having one platform that can accommodate different models. But also, once you have a developer framework in a department, it is at the earlier stages, it is very important to expose this environment to the validator and set the validator with an environment that mimics the developer environment. No? And this probably can be part of the training as well. No? In this case, training perhaps owned by the first line and delivered by the first line to validators. And this makes things much more efficient. It makes everybody better, expose the validators to models more closely. The quality of the challenges increases, and everybody benefits from this. No? Obviously, once you have that in place, then you can start applying some software concept like continuous improvement, because suddenly now the validator is able to have their own way of doing things. They can start developing models, and they can start maybe creating additional tests. And this can cover blind spots on the developer side. And obviously, it is more of a best practice that the validator is able to develop new tests that challenge the assumptions of the developer, no? And that are more aligned with what is expected in the validation report, no? Touching a bit more, or like we mentioned before, about producing evidence that it fits the validation process. So this is quite important as well. No? Another challenge that we touched earlier on the challenges section of the webinar is communication between the developers and the validators. No? Both, they work with sometimes different timelines, or if the conversations are not structured, are not centralized, this is another source of inefficiency and back and forth between the validator and the developer. The conversations between the validator and developer are extremely helpful. They contain a lot of rich information, and is the source of findings and the source of the whys behind assumptions and key outcomes of the validation, no? Even the severity of the findings. And these things, they come out sometimes at the last minute when suddenly the developer, maybe they don't agree on a particular severity for a finding, and it's difficult to go back and identify how a red was put into this finding, no? And even the validator, maybe because they need to deal with so many models, it's difficult to sometimes to justify, no? And again, this is a source of back and forth and issues as well, no? In terms of the outcomes of the validation report, to have an agreement between both parties, no? So a recommendation here is to be able to have a centralized system to store these conversations, and especially link these conversations to findings, link these conversations to risk areas and to sections of the model documentation. So then it's easy to go back and to identify how things were done that way. So this it is also important to store these Q&A logs, because in some cases, for example, in periodic validation, when the same model needs to be validated again, is good not to start every validation like it's the first one ever, but leverage on all the information and discussions that they have done. They have been taking part before. No? It can speed as well the process quite a lot, and even one can reuse Q&As from model to model, no? Because some of the questions might be common to more than one model as well. So it is good to have, for example, the set of questions that were asked at the evidence gathering stage. What sort of questions the validator is posing to developers to get the evidence they need. So this might be something that can apply to different models, and different validation exercises as well. So definitely very, very important to have a centralized Q&A log as well in this case. And then finally, to finish with this, with the strategies and with the webinar as well, at least the content part, is touching on the innovation side. We mentioned before that innovation on the first line is challenging, and there are reasons for that. Obviously, developers they work under pressure to deliver models that move the bank's dial, make decisions. They need to follow regulations, and obviously, we mentioned that banks, for good reasons, they are averse to risk and averse to change, and it's not easy to introduce changes in a model, especially if these changes are abrupt and they imply going from traditional econometric models to sort of black box deep learning methodologies. So this is something that it will raise many questions, and so this gets in the way of innovation in some cases. So a good idea, actually, good strategy here is to shift the innovation to the validation side. So this is a place where innovation can happen more safely, where validators can actually develop more advanced models to challenge the models that they need to validate. And this is a very good way to try out different methodologies and different techniques in a disciplined way, in a way that there is some governance, but the models are not directly on the critical path. And once these advanced models have gone through perhaps several validation exercises, then they are much better positioned to be able to be transferred to the first line. So this is something that I find extremely interesting. It empowers validators, and again, it makes everybody better. It helps the bank to be able to innovate, and at the same time, don't let innovation expose the bank to risks that actually can benefit the institution. So definitely, this is an extremely interesting practice, and I really recommend MRM practitioners to try to follow this approach for innovation. So yeah, so this is the end of the content that I have for this webinar. Just to summarize the strategies we've been through. Create an MRM map of guidelines, transform guidelines into actionable risk assessments. After that, deliver training to your colleagues, participants, and practitioners within the MRM framework. Always document models, not in vacuum, but with validation in mind. It's always good to hold models accountable as well, and to try to extract risk from these models by using confidence intervals or sensitivity analysis. We talk about transforming developer evidence into risk evidence through summarizing tables, plots into concrete key risk indicators. Create a validation friendly environment for validators to be able to criticize models on the development side by accessing the developer environment as well. Set auditable conversations and Q&A centralized logs between developers and validators, so they can be reused and they can speed up the validation process and make conversations more useful and objective as well. And finally, a way to innovate is to try that, start with the validation unit, where innovation can be done in a more controlled way that can then be transferred to the first line, with exposing the first line to high risks and due to innovation. And yeah, that's the end of the content. I hope you find it useful, and yeah, happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Juan. And I so appreciate you coming on and delivering such a fantastic presentation. So to those of you watching, if you'd like to learn more about ValidMine, who we are, and how we're helping model risk management teams improve their model development and model validation processes, definitely visit that link below, validmine.com/contact. We'll be back in a couple weeks with a new presenter and a new topic. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again to Juan.
Thank you.